Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Yes indeed, time for another rock and read. Today we'll read chapter 8 of White Line Fever by Lemmy. Chapter 8 is called Brian. Here we go. So here we were in America, blissfully unaware that Motorhead had already reached its peak in Britain, and we did have a great time. Eddie and Phil had never been to the US before. I, of course, already knew my way around, but it's always refreshing seeing a place through new eyes. Phil Clumso managed to go all the way across the US without suffering any major injuries, although the salad nearly killed him in Florida. He and Eddie, they were used to English salads where you get a leaf and a couple of boiled eggs. So at this restaurant in Florida, they both ordered double salads, and I didn't discourage them. I just watched as the waiters rolled up with 2 carts, an acreage of greenery. Phil and Eddie practically had to fight their way out through this treacherous Mugwumbi swamp. Myself, I won't go near vegetables, too healthy for the likes of me. I'd never met Ozzy nor anyone in his band before, but I got to know them during this tour. Rudy Sarzo and Tommy Aldridge were nice enough guys, but they were quiet-like. They were just, the bassist and drummer. Rhythm sections never get much attention, really, unless the band belongs to one of them. Randy Rhoads was Ozzy's guitarist back then, and he was a much bigger deal. I believe he had been writing songs with Ozzy. My big memory of him, however, was that he was terrible at asteroids. So I wound up beating him in asteroids all the way across America. I was quite friendly with Randy, so I found it a terrible shame when he died in a plane crash a year later. Nevertheless, I have to say, he wasn't the guitar player he became after his death. As with Bob Calvert, a guy who was more or less ignored during his lifetime suddenly became a huge genius. Randy was a good guitar player to be sure, but he wasn't the great innovator he was later made out to be. God knows what people will say about me after I'm gone. Ozzy was a nice guy, still is. Very twisted, but nice. Of course, you're going to be a bit warped when people are throwing half a dozen doves with broken legs and wings on stage every time you play a gig. Other things landed at his feet too. Frogs, live rattlesnakes, a deer's head, a bull's head, all because of that story about him biting the head off a dove during a meeting with his record label. I don't know how he went on working after that tour. He must have been constantly freaked, never knowing what was going to come flying up at him. Makes you feel kind of bad for the guy, doesn't it? Ozzy really was having a rough time on the tour we did with him. He nearly died on this trek. He was at the height of his nervousness and the depths of his despair. And he was just overdoing everything. We kept finding him flat on his face, passed out on the floor everywhere at the beginning of the tour. Finally, his girlfriend and later wife Sharon took over and pulled him out of it. And that was great. I've had some ups and downs doing business with Sharon since then, but I've got to give her that. You wouldn't have any more Ozzy Osbourne records if it wasn't for Sharon, and I think Ozzy would be the first to acknowledge that. The Americans didn't know quite what to make of Motorhead at first. We had quite a few jaws dropping to the floor during the Ozzy tour. Some places understood what we were about. We got a rousing response on the coast, New York, and LA. They also liked us in Detroit and Chicago, which are still a couple of our main areas today. Ohio was good too, and we won over Texas since then. But apart from that, we might as well not have bothered that first time around. They were baffled by us completely. I think a good portion of the Midwest was rather frightened by us. Most of the audience didn't know who we were. An American label, Mercury, had picked up Ace of Spades, but nobody seemed to know about that. The label did absolutely nothing to promote the record, and what else is new? So we were this strange, unknown entity every time we hit the stage. We did have our few fans, though. One of them was Lars Ulrich. He wasn't Metallica's drummer then. He was just this little teenage kid living in LA. He loved us. As a matter of fact, he was in charge of the American Motorhead fan club, which I assume consists of guys like him who own tons of import records. Those kids were big supporters of the new wave of British heavy metal movement, which took off around this time. The NWOBHM was great for some bands. It sent Iron Maiden over the top. It didn't do us much good, though. We came along a bit too early for it, and then our popularity resurged just a little bit too late for the big metal and hard rock boom of the late 80s. Our first American tour was a mixed bag, but the ironic thing is that when we got back to England, we headlined a huge show at Port Vale Football Club in front of 40,000 people over Ozzy Osbourne, so that gives you an idea of how massive we were at the time in Britain. That was probably our loudest show ever, and by then we had already earned a reputation for the sheer volume of our gigs. Admittedly, we did like it loud. We couldn't hear it otherwise because we were deaf. At Port Vale, we built the entire stage out of PA. I mean, everything. It was all speakers everywhere to the tune of 117,000 watts. At soundcheck, a guy rang up from 4 miles away to complain that he couldn't hear his TV. And that was just Eddie's guitar. Plus, there was the spectacular publicity stunt that night. During our show, this plane flew low over the field and dropped these guys with Motorhead parachutes. 6 of them landed smack in the middle of the field, but unfortunately one of them missed and went into the allotments next door. This one old geezer witnessed the whole thing. He had been standing there with a shovel guarding his allotment from the hippies, you know, and he said, "Hey, that last lad came down like a sucker." Boom! On the ground. They took him away in a doormobile. I just assumed that wayward paratrooper recovered from his injuries because we didn't hear any more about it. We're also quite popular with the cops back home. They were always trying to bust us in those days. It was very different from what it is now. We couldn't go out of the house. The cops were just waiting outside the front door, or failing that, they'd bust you on the street. Around this time, August of '81, they caught Phil with about 5 pounds worth of pot, and he ended up in court being fined 40 pounds. Stupid, petty, isn't it? But it wound up making news because we were these famous badass rock stars. Motorcycle Irene was with Phil when he got busted, and they found pot on her too. But she only got fined 20 pounds, maybe because she had bigger tits than him. Minor hassles aside, we had a lot of fun with our fleeting time at the top. One very satisfying moment was when we played the Summer Night Festival in Nuremberg, Germany, and we were billed over Blue Oyster Cult, who had so soundly screwed us over at our first Hammersmith Odon gig. We didn't do anything particularly nasty to them, though. After all, they were old news. We just didn't lend them the PA, that's all. It was also around that time that I made a record with the Nolan sisters. It was just a one-day gig. I got a phone call and did it for a giggle. It was a song called Don't Do That, and the band included me on bass, Cozy Powell on drums, and ex-Whitesnake guitarist Mickey Moody, Colleen and Linda Nolan sang, and Status Quo's road manager Bob Young also added some vocals and harp. We called ourselves the Young and Moody Band and made a video for the tune too. The Nolan sisters were great fun. We used to run across them quite a bit because they were on the charts at the same time Motorhead was. Everyone thought they were soppy little popster, but they weren't. They'd been around. They'd played with Sinatra at the Sands in Vegas. They were tough chicks managed by their father, but they were really great. And funny as once our manager Douglas was talking to Linda Nolan in the Top of the Pops bar, and he dropped some money on the floor. When he bent down to pick it up, Linda smirked and said, "While you're down there." That was the last thing he expected out of a Nolan sister. Maybe wishful thinking, and he dreamt it up, but it shocked the out of him. I don't understand why people want to think that women don't like sex, or that the ones that do are terrible and deprived. Everybody likes to. We should have grown up to that extent by now, where we recognize sex for what it is, fun and recreation. I've said many a time that sex is the most fun you can have without laughing. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this book, part of the reason I got into rock and roll was for the chicks, and everybody in Motorhead has always had as many as they could get their hands on, or who could get their hands on us. One time at Bolton Casino, I was sitting at this table, and this girl came up and blew me right there. Eddie swung by to say, "We're ready to leave, lad." "Could you hang on a minute?" I asked very strained-like. Then he saw the high heels protruding from underneath the tablecloth and got the idea. So he left us alone, and I drifted back into the ecstasy. Pleasant interludes like that happened all the time. When it came to chicks, we weren't really worried about quality in my band, and actually quality is certainly in the eye of the beholder. What people call quality is usually better dressed, which doesn't cut any with me. I've met chicks who look like bad ladies, who have more brains, better conversation, and are just all around sexier than the best dressed models in the world. It's true. Those model types are like thoroughbred horses. They look good, but they're dumb as... I've had a lot of what people would call around, and I like them because they're honest and upfront. They're like me. They say, I like, let's go. And really, that's the way it should be. Obviously, rock stardom has its ups, and you can take that several different ways, but there was the occasional downside. At the beginning of Motorhead's career, we used to hang out in the bar with the fans before the gig, but eventually it got to be too much. You start getting fans who think they're in the band. They dress up as me, and after a while, when they look in the mirror, they see me instead of themselves. That can get very weird. There were guys all over the place called Lemmy, and loads of kids called Lemmy too. Poor little... One is a girl. Another guy gave his son my last name as a first name. And there's cats and rats and dogs and parakeets named after me. We were inundated with adoring fans, not to mention the occasional nun, so eventually we had to stop being as accessible as we once were. That was a shame. I always miss that, because when you hang out with the kids, you get an idea of what's really going on out on the street. A lot of bands divorce themselves from that as soon as possible, and I think that's a big mistake. Some bands never even meet their fans, don't even know who they are or what they look like. They just see the spotlight shining in their eyes, then they go off stage into their own little world. Musicians who do that are missing out on a lot. I still like talking to fans today, except for the occasional drunk who insist on singing Ace of Spades in my ear non-stop. We've made a few albums since the Ace of Spades days, after all. If he's drunk and starts singing something from one of our last couple records, I might not mind so much. Another problem with being very popular is that some people claim that you've sold out, but really, that's more their problem, not mine. Commercials, whatever people are buying, that's all. That doesn't mean the music changes. For example, our first album didn't sell very well, so we were still street credible. Then Overkill was a minor hit, and some of our fans left us because they thought we were going commercial. That was really stupid. Couldn't they tell the music was basically the same, just a little better, because we were a tighter unit after playing together for a few years? By the time No Sleep Till Hammersmith came around, there was a small backlash going on with the cries of, "Sell out!" Since that was a live album of songs from when we weren't commercial, it looked like they needed a good thrashing for being elitist, overfed snobs. We knew we were doing just what we wanted to musically, so that was easy to ignore. It was Motorhead's best year ever, 1981, but it ended on a very bad note. We spent the last part of the year touring Europe, and my flatmate, Andy Elsmore, got murdered. He was a little guy who used to run a cinema. Somebody came into my house while I was away and stabbed him 52 times in his face, neck, and chest. Then they set the place on fire in an attempt to disguise the murder. Still, poor Andy managed to crawl all the way down the corridor to the TV room before he died. That's where they found him. It was a terrible thing. The media, of course, didn't get it right. The headlines said things like, Motorhead involved in drug slang, or some bull. It had nothing to do with us, and I'd been gone a month, so I didn't know who Andy was mixing with. But back to the band. At this point in our career, unfortunately but perhaps inevitably, we started getting complacent. Everything we had done up to that point had turned to gold. We thought it was just going to carry on magically, but Iron Fist was not the record to follow up an album that went straight in at number 1. To be honest, we were screwed anyway. No Sleep Till Hammersmith was live, and you can't follow up a live album that sold the way No Sleep did. We wound up getting a lot of mixed reviews, which didn't surprise me in the least. It did surprise Eddie, who produced it with Will Reed Dick, and I think it broke his heart in a way. But the record didn't do too badly sales-wise. It peaked at number 4. Not quite as good as our previous couple releases, but still quite respectable. The disillusionment hadn't really set in yet, however, and we began our UK tour with high hopes. The dates were very good. Our manager, Douglas, had come up with the idea of the Bomber Lightning rig, and since that worked out so well, he now fancied himself as a man who knows about stage shows. So, he had to outdo himself on our Iron Fist tour. We didn't even know what kind of marvel he'd cooked up with until something like 3 days before we hit the road. We made it, and you can't change it now. It was quite dramatic, really. The curtain would open up and the stage would be absolutely empty. Nothing, not even the red lights on the amps. We were up on the ceiling, see? We had a stage that was on 4 gantries with all the equipment on it. The drums, amplifiers, the lights, the whole stage was in the roof. Then the music would start and we'd come down out of clouds of smoke and colored lights, and as we were making our descent, this huge fist would open up and there were searchlights at the tips of its fingers. Naturally enough, the fist didn't work properly the first night, and we got stuck going back up as well. The stage rose about halfway and stopped moving, and the curtains caught on the stage. People could see us milling about going, "What the are we going to do now? And how do we get down off of here?" Filthy, of course, nearly stepped from his kid into oblivion. Eddie caught him just in time. But after the first couple of days, it worked great. We never used the fist again, though. That went straight back to the shop and stayed there. Tank, a band Eddie had produced, opened for us on those dates. That was our friend Algie Ward's band. He had been in the Dam but got fired, and then he formed Tank. He was bass player and leader of his band, as was I, and he felt very good about that. They had done very well on tour with us in Europe, but in England they had wife trouble. The wives wanted to come on the road, and of course they were only new boys, so they let them, and that's death for any band. I'm not coming off chauvinistic by saying this, but wives separate the band, plain and simple. Let's say you have 3 guys in a band. Maybe they go to 3 hotel rooms after the gigs, but they're the only ones in their rooms. But if your old lady's along, you get off stage and you have to hang out with her. You don't discuss the gig with the rest of the group, and you don't go back to the hotel bar for a drink because you're with your old lady, right? She's standing there, and there are a lot of things you won't say in front of her because you think she'll be bored or you got to pay attention to her. So that completely upped the communication within the band. And also a lot of wives are in their husbands' ears. The other guys would be nothing without you. You don't get enough credit, and the rest. It causes a lot of grumbling and dissension and can destroy a band. I've seen it happen many times. It's happened within my band. So as a result, Tank wound up doing very badly with us in the UK. Since we were still very big rock stars, we were pulling all sorts of Spinal Tap. Incidentally, Spinal Tap was a very accurate film. Whoever wrote it must have spent some time on the road with rock bands. We were bad boys in those days, but then we still are today, only everyone's used to it now. People get horrified by Motorhead. "The cheese isn't here. Where's the cheese?" "Sorry, man, we couldn't get it." "Oh yeah, I can't get any cheese in a big town on a Wednesday at 6 o'clock. Get out and get the cheese." Because it's not the cheese that matters, is it? It's the principle that they didn't bother. That's what pisses me off. I'd send the promoters and their minions on all kinds of errands. Get out there and get me this. If it's on the rider, it had better well be there. If the drum roadie wanted Twiglets, and ours did, he got them. Our present guitarist Phil Campbell sent out for Chinese food at one show, and he told the guy to get a portion of Benoit balls too, and the guy came back with them. But here's one thing that has always puzzled me, and it happens in every country in the world. Your rider says you get so many towels, right? And they give you these tiny foot-square pieces of cloth. What the is that? We took no from anybody. At one point, we were scheduled to play at this radio station, Radio Clyde in Glasgow. We were supposed to be doing a sound check, but the guy was a real, and he kept us waiting for ages. Radio people are notoriously unsympathetic to anything you're doing because they're so self-important. So after sitting there for a while, I said to Eddie, let's do 'em. So we unwound the fire hose from the wall, stuck it through the door of the studio, jammed the door shut, and turned it on. And we left. They didn't ask us back. Rather unsporting of them, really. Cops really got on our ass around this time. They went through everybody's house, the roadie's hotel, even our manager's house. I was in a hotel in Swiss Cottage, so they missed me. They had this serious operation going, dogs, door smashers and all. And out of everybody, 25 crew, 3 band members, the manager and his wife and their staff, the cops came up with all of a half gram of cocaine. I believe a little bit of dope and 1 Mandrix. We went down to the Nick and I asked, What reason did you have for mounting this massive operation? It was an anonymous tip-off, the magistrate said. We heard you were selling acid to the audiences from the stage. What idiocy! I'm singing and playing bass. When am I going to have time to go down front and say, anybody want any acid? Not to mention handing out change. I would have needed a change belt instead of a bullet belt. Holes, as if the cops don't have any real drug pushers to chase. Or why aren't they out there catching the Yorkshire Ripper, people like that, instead of around with a band who's just playing gigs and taking a few drugs on their own? Of course, telling them this never goes down well with the cops. As I've mentioned before, I'm more than happy to work with female performers. Before Motorhead began its American tour, I popped in at a studio in London to visit this all-girl band from France, Speed Queen, who were making an album. Their singer, Stevie, was great. She sounded kind of like a singer that's around now, and incidentally getting far less attention than she deserves. Nina Cial is from a band called Skew Siskin. They both have real rough voices like Edith Piaf, only with guitars. I even added some backing vocals to one of their songs. The album was in French though, so it never got heard anywhere but France. A few days after that, Motorhead flew to Toronto so that we could record an EP with Wendy O. Williams. That session resulted in the demise of what many Motorhead fans call our classic lineup. Although those who think that way probably haven't heard the band in the last few years. Wendy O and her band the Plasmatics have been pretty much forgotten nowadays, but she was a completely outrageous punk rock agitator. She sawed guitars in half with a chainsaw and blew up police cars on stage. Once she drove her car into a pile of explosives on a New York harbor and jumped out at the last minute. After she did that, she went straight to Florida to wrestle alligators. I thought, this chick's excellent. Plus, I'd seen pictures of her, and she did take a good picture. After our EP with Girls School hit, people were always on us to collaborate on records, especially with girls. And I really enjoy making records with birds. 8 geezers in the studio can really be a drag. Recording with girls usually produces better results because it causes an interesting kind of friction. And also the scenery is a bit better. Abrasiveness and scenery. I'm all for both, and it was clear I'd get that from Wendy O. It was touted as this extraordinary combination of punk and heavy metal. 2 warring factions at the time. The songs we were going to do were a Motorhead tune, No Class, Master Plan, which was a Plasmatics number, and as the single, Stand By Your Man. Yes, the country song. Eddie was supposed to produce the track for us, and unfortunately, he had Will Reed Dick, whom I generally refer to as Evil Red Dick, in tow again. The session was problematic, to say the least. Wendy took a long time to get in tune, and it wound Eddie up. She tried her parts a few times, and she sounded terrible, I will say that. You'd think she was never going to get it, but I knew she would if I just worked with her. In addition to this, Eddie wasn't playing guitar. He was only working as producer. We were using Wendy's guitars from the Plasmatics, with me and Phil on bass and drums. Eddie just wasn't acting terribly thrilled with the whole scenario, and finally said he was going out to eat. But we found him in the other room sulking with Evil Red. It was bull. We could have worked through our problems if Will Reed Dick hadn't been there, because Eddie would have been nobody to go off with it, away from the band. He would have had to stay in and lump it, and then it would have been done and forgotten. But we ended up exchanging a few words, and Eddie left the studio. Later, Phil and I went back to the hotel. Phil went ahead of me, and he came up and told me, Eddie's left the band. Actually, Eddie used to leave the band about every 2 months, but this time it just so happened that we didn't ask him back. We didn't try to persuade him, which is why he stayed away. That surprised him a bit, I think, but we were just tired of him because he was always freaking out and he was drinking a lot back then. He's become very much better now since he stopped. So, Eddie did our first 2 American dates, Toronto. There's a video of that gig, but Eddie was terrible and so was I. I got a cramp halfway through the show and couldn't play. In New York. We had to get another guitar player fast so that we can continue the tour, and we chose Brian Robertson, who had been in Thin Lizzy. Technically, he was a better guitarist than Eddie, but ultimately, he wasn't right for Motorhead. With him, our slide downward began to pick up speed, which was unfair really, because the record we made with him, Another Perfect Day, was very good. Looking back, and I must say hindsight is 2020, it was good for us that we fell when we did. We wouldn't have been going now if we'd carried on getting more and more famous. We would have wound up a bunch of twats with houses in the country and gotten divorced from each other. So it was just as well, I think, for Motorhead's moral overall. It's important for a band to be hungry, because that is the motivation that makes all bands work. And if anybody knows about being hungry for long periods of time, it's me. But back to Robbo. I'd known him for years. We met under a table at Dingwall's. There was a fight going on and all of us cowards were hiding. Yellow Streak aside, he was one of Phil's heroes because Phil is a complete Thin Lizzy freak. And Brian was great on stage with him. He used to wear a white cord suit, quite striking with his curly, longish hair. He was available, so we flew him out immediately, and he arrived in Toronto with reddish-dyed short hair. I was horror-stricken, but I thought to myself, well, he's enough of a trooper. It turned out he wasn't, though. He wound up just being a pain in the ass. He was the only person in any of my bands that I threatened with physical violence. He was threatening me back, to be fair. We both had a chair in our hands and were going to hit each other with them. But that happened months later when he first got in Motorhead. The only hint of impending doom was the red hair. Gradually we got more clues. When Brian first came into the band, I said to him, remember when you were in Thin Lizzy, you had that thing with Scott Gorham where he'd wear the black cord outfit and you'd wear the white one and you each used to flash over to the sides of the stage? That'd be great. I wear black. Why don't you get that white outfit back on? Oh no, I couldn't do that, Lemmy, he said. And there was other. Like he wanted a contract with us for only one album at a time. Basically, he wanted an out beforehand in case Motorhead didn't happen for him. All this was easy to ignore in the beginning because for a while he was dead on. After he hooked up with us in Toronto, he only had a few hours of rehearsal before our first gig with him at Harpo's in Detroit, but he played like a demon. We finished the American tour in June and then went off to Japan, our first trip there, and he was great the whole time. Japan loved Motorhead from the start. Brian had already been there with his band after Thin Lizzy, Wild Horses, and he told me with all the confidence and with his broad Scottish accent, don't think you're going to get all this acclaim like you're used to here in Japan. You won't because they don't do nothing. They just sit there and clap their wee hands. Oh, don't be too sure about that, Brian, I said. You're in Motorhead now, which probably irked him like... So we got there, and sure enough, the first time the curtains opened across the stage, it was all, ah, Remy! Brian got a bit upset by that. Brian Robertson. That's rather unfortunate, isn't it? I love Japan as much as they loved us. It's a complete culture shock because nothing there is like it is in the West. The girls go out in bunches there, but they don't mind a bit of adventure. A big group of them will come into your hotel room and take all their clothes off. It's very much a bonding thing with them. It's because they don't have this guilt we do. Most Japanese girls are very, very pretty, and everyone's polite, which I like. Good manners cost nothing, and most people in America, England, and in many parts of Europe are mainly arrogant, brutal, stupid holes who don't give up about anybody. They push you to one side and elbow you out of their way. They don't do that in Japan, but make no mistake, they're very horny as well. There are places we wound up visiting every time we went back. Pip's Bar was one of them, and unfortunately it closed down a while back. Now it's a karaoke bar. They were very friendly there, and they didn't care if you fell on the floor. Plus, they had a couple of pin tables, which was great drunken entertainment for me. But that's nothing compared to the amusement arcades. The amusement arcades are unbelievable. It's like being in the Starship Enterprise. The weirdest thing I've ever seen in Japan, however, was about 20 Japanese rock hillbilly fans walking down the street. They had it down, the quiffs, the leather jackets, the walk. Japanese teddy boys. That took some getting used to. It was back in England that Brian started getting very strange. He did fine on our first show there, which was at Wrexham Football Club. We were headlining, and down near the bottom of the bill was a new band from America called Twisted Sister. It wasn't long after this gig that Twisted Sister became huge MTV sensations. Keep in mind, MTV was just starting up in 1982, but this was the band's first time in England ever, and they were terrified, the poor... I ran into them backstage. Here was this group of big geezers all dressed like women, and they were so nervous they were spitting teeth. I could see that they were going to just fall to bits, so I said, listen, I'll go out and introduce you if you want. And they were all like, "Oh yeah, please." So I went out there and said, "These are some friends of mine, so give them a break. Twisted Sister." That made sure they wouldn't get bottled off at least. And they went on and blew the place down. I introduced them again when they played the marquee. I mean, I would expect them to do the same thing for us. And the band's singer, Dee Snider, did so a couple times. He also got us on MTV when he had his own show. We had some good times with Twisted Sister. Later on in the year, they were on The Tube, a TV program that recorded in Newcastle, and we went up and jammed on It's Only Rock and Roll at the end of the broadcast. I ran around one side of the stage, and as I was putting on my bass, Brian suddenly appeared on the other side and bang! He fell straight on his face. It was funny as... You could always rely on Brian for some unintentional entertainment. He was less than entertaining at our show after Wrexham, however. It was a stadium gig at Hackney Speedway in London that the Hells Angels put on. Everybody who worked on that show, the crew, everyone were Hells Angels. They lost a fortune putting it on, and they never promoted another show after that. I remember one of the guys, Goat, was telling me, "I know where I can steal a generator. Up the motorway, they've got loads of them. Nobody'll miss it." "I think they'll miss it," I said, "and I think they'll catch you doing it." Somehow they got a generator though. So here we were surrounded by these massive, tough bikers, and Brian comes out on stage with his red hair wearing these green satin shorts. A lot of muttering was going on. "With the shorts on. That's Motorhead's new guitar player. Ah, let's kill him." You could feel the terrible undercurrent. Brian doesn't know how close he came. I stopped them, but they really were going to kill him. After all, he was reflecting badly on them. The Angels are aggressively masculine, and they don't like that. There he was, poking it right in their eye. Whereas that's laudable in a sociological sense, he really could have picked a better place to make a statement. Brian's fashion sense continued to shock and horrify fans throughout our tour of Europe at the end of the year. Let's face it, ballet shoes and Motorhead do not mix. He stood out like a sore thumb, and I guess that's what he wanted. He was trying so hard to proclaim to everybody that he wasn't actually in Motorhead, and he was just a guest artist. Our record label didn't like him either. I think Bronze would have preferred us to break up at this point, really. The Stand By Your Man EP didn't get much promotion, but we did go into the studio in March of '83 to make an album. Another Perfect Day shows a lot of Brian's influence, which musically wasn't a bad thing. Even the producer, Tony Platt, was Brian's boy, but he did a very good job, so I have no complaints about that. Brian, of course, was his usual pain-in-the-ass self, but we've dealt with it. The only thing I didn't like about the record was that there was a bit too much guitar. Some of those solos didn't have to be that long, God knows. But other than that, I thought it was excellent. Our fans hated it, though. They thought we were going commercial. There's that word again. It got up to about number 20, and that was it, so it wasn't as commercial as people claimed it was. But Another Perfect Day has stood the test of time, and a lot of fans have recanted now and come to like it, but that didn't help us back then. I think Another Perfect Day was a good change for us, and maybe it was a mistake that we didn't experiment more earlier. Maybe we should have carried on in that direction, but not with Brian. After the album came out, we toured with him through England and America. That was a loony tour. They didn't know what to do with us, so they kept billing us with bands like the Outlaws, and the audience just hated him. For one thing, he refused to play any of our old songs we were known for: Ace of Spades, Overkill, Bomber, and Motorhead. He didn't want to be associated with the past. Actually, Phil was in agreement with him on that, and I could see their point, but let's face it, the kids want to hear the old stuff. I mean, if I go to see Little Richard, I want to hear Long Tall Sally, and if I don't, I'm going to be thoroughly pissed off. Even though I'm sick to death of it, Motorhead should do Ace of Spades. People want to hear Ace of Spades, and you can't fight that. To refuse to play it, or those other tunes, is very bad news. And then there was Brian's clothing thing, too. On our last tour with him, he was wearing what looked like sweatpants, only they were made out of garbadine. And he had them tied up at the bottom with 2 strips of old white towel, plus the blazing red hair. He was being awkward just for the sake of it. But I didn't fire Brian for any of those reasons. I would have kept him in the band forever if he was playing all right. It was just when he started up that he became unbearable. We were partway through a European tour in the fall of '83 when it just got ridiculous. We were playing at the Rotation Club in Hanover, Germany, and we had just done Another Perfect Day, and he started playing it again. So I stalked over to him and said, "We just played that." "Oh, sorry," he said, and started it again a third time. At that point it was good night from him, good night from me, and thank you very much time. We canceled the rest of the tour because we knew we couldn't go on like that. Brian was a mess. Once in Spain I found him in a hotel lobby in front of a display of those knickknacks hotels have, crystal teddy bears and like that. He was leaning with his head against the glass like he was looking into it, but I went over to him and he was asleep with his bag over one shoulder and a bottle of Cointreau in his hand. We got him into the car and took him to the airport and propped him up in one of the chairs in the waiting room. He lay there unconscious with his head thrown back and his mouth open, and little kids were putting cigarettes out in his mouth. 'Cause they don't care in Spain. He wasn't much livelier on stage, so he had to go. After we got back from the aborted European tour, Phil and I went down to Brian's house in Richmond and fired him. It was fairly amicable, really. He was expecting it. Motorhead was down one guitar player once again. I finished up the year by singing and playing bass on Night of the Hawks for Hawkwind's EP Earth Ritual Preview. But then, the only person from my time who was still in Hawkwind was Dave Brock. But of course, it's his band, as Motorhead is mine. I knew my band was going to carry on regardless. I just didn't know who was going to be in it next. Well, that's the end of Chapter 8. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 8 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.